I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. It was always going to be a risky strategy. The coalition spent the week pursuing Finance Minister Katy Gallagher, who admitted being given a heads up days before Brittany Higgins went public with her rape allegation. The aim was to uncover a secret Labor plot to politically damage the Morrison Government. Instead, the debate took a sharp turn when the little-known Liberal Senator David Van joined the attack. It was too much to bear for one senator sitting in the chamber at the time. Lidia Thorpe rounded on Senator Van, accusing him of sexual harassment and assault. Soon, other women came forward complaining about inappropriate touching. Senator Van denies the allegations, but Peter Dutton promptly kicked him out of the party room and now wants him out of Parliament altogether. Later, I'll speak with the Leader of the Nationals in the Senate, Bridget McKenzie. But first, the panel, Patricia Karvelas, Henderson and Katina Curtis. So, look, I want to start with what we know about the allegations or suggestions around David Van, because this does date back to 2021, in fact, Katina, when Lidia Thorpe first raised some concerns privately. You'd written about this, in fact, before all of this blew up this week. What happened back then?
Yes, so Lidia Thorpe, I guess in the wake of the reckoning that was happening about the culture of Parliament at that time in early 2021, she gave an interview to a couple of media outlets. I was one of them. We were all in the room together, and she was explaining, you know, how she felt. She felt threatened. She said she had been inappropriately touched. She didn't name any names at that time, but she talked about making sure that there was always a staff member in her office late at night or someone walking with her in the corridors, making sure that her office door was locked if anyone was in there alone. So she was clearly very concerned. And she raised similar points again in an interview with the ABC after quitting the Greens earlier this year. So she has been quite consistent over the past 18 months, really, in saying this is what happened to me. And then I guess she was provoked into naming names in the Senate.
And we'll come to that. But back then in 2021, she did raise it with, she was a Green senator at the time, she raised it with the Greens leadership, who raised it with the Liberal Senate leadership as well. In fact, Simon Birmingham said on Friday to Afternoon Briefing that he also let the then Prime Minister Scott Morrison's office know about this too.
His office was made aware, but it was something handled through the Senate leadership at the time.
So his office was made aware, but he personally wasn't told?
Well, I can't speak for how his office necessarily conveyed the information, but at the time it was handled through the Senate leadership and done in a manner that was very cooperative with Senator Waters as the Greens leader in the Senate.
So, Anna, Simon Birmingham knew, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison's office knew. What did they do, as far as we know?
Well, as far as we know, they took that information and they assisted in the process of trying to ensure that Lidia Thorpe had a sense of safety in the building. But they didn't, it appears, in a kind of siloed sense, end up doing anything that would leave a trace for a leadership to come to be aware that there was an allegation. If we're to take on face value the fact that Peter Dutton now, as opposition leader, says that he wasn't aware of this before it was raised in Parliament.
Is this a little curious, PK? I mean, they may not have known, you know, the nature or the specifics of what Lidia Thorpe was alleging here, but they clearly knew there was enough of an issue that he needed to move office. This, of course, let's remember, is 2021. This was the year that all of this reckoning in Parliament House was going on, this Me Too movement, the Brittany Higgins allegations and so on. And you've got an allegation or a complaint about one of their own senators.
Let's call it out for what it is. It is breathtaking that they have an allegation that's this serious. This is a senator saying that she doesn't feel safe at work to be a senator, and the workaround that they found, aren't they clever? Not, is to move him physically away from her. OK, wouldn't you twig and go, he might be close to someone else then that he might harass, if that's the allegation? Wouldn't you do some due diligence and investigation about your senator? There's been a massive failure here. I don't think that finding this lovely little solution where he's somewhere else and potentially actually a risk, potentially, to other women in the building. That's what they did. It is very serious, and it wasn't until, of course, Amanda Stoker, who was a former senator, went on the record, can I say, with incredible bravery and principle to say that this indeed had happened to her as well. That's her allegation, that her bottom was pinched twice at an informal gathering. She tried to deal with it by raising it with him and trying to change the behaviour, right? Trying to make sure that he knew that this wasn't on in the future. We know Michaelia Cash also was informed, and yet still a systemic failure inside the Liberal Party that was then governing to actually deal with these complaints and figure out what's going on with this guy.
There were contemporaneous questions being raised at the time. Are there any other allegations that your government is looking into? Are there any other issues around culture that need to be looked into further? And the idea that there was something that had been raised and it wasn't being in some way dealt with, or that information wasn't being provided, it is very hard to understand how that could have happened in that climate.
I think it really goes back to the point that was, the point of the Jenkins review was saying that Parliament House is this really strange workplace where there's 220-something employers, effectively, and there was no central HR. So there was, if this was happening in a corporation, if there were multiple allegations being raised, they would all be going to the same central point. There would be some kind of central, a list or a compilation, and someone would realise that maybe there was a problem here. Whereas because there was no central point, there was nowhere to gather.
Exactly. Amanda Stoker had raised some concerns with some about what happened to her, Lidia Thorpe with others, but there was no connection of the dots, essentially. Exactly. Now, we need to keep stressing David Van denies all of this. I want to come to what's happened this week. Because Peter Dutton, when Lidia Thorpe first got up, as we saw in the Senate, and said what she said, look, Peter Dutton was quite specific. He spoke to Ray Hadley on Friday and said he did not speak to Lidia Thorpe and did not act off the back of her contributions to the Senate on this. It was only when further allegations, Amanda Stoker, obviously gave him a call, that he decided to act. Is that understandable that he wouldn't speak to Lidia Thorpe after she'd made these accusations against one of his own senators?
No, I don't know how anyone would think that's acceptable. No. I think actually Lidia Thorpe, who, I don't know what word you want to use, but was clearly provoked. He was Senator David Van standing up, giving a speech, and we'll talk about that later, but about the pursuit of Katy Gallagher and Labor weaponising rape. And obviously, and I've been in that situation, I think lots of women will relate to this, she was just, I imagine it was like a fire was lit in her, thinking, you're saying that after what happened allegedly to her? And so, in a very kind of like organic moment, she raises this. And so all of a sudden this becomes real. He should have asked some questions at that point. It wasn't until, and a few people have made this point, including Lidia Thorpe, it wasn't until a white woman raised it that it became legitimate. I think that's definitely column A. Partly it was an issue around that, but it was also because it was a woman on their own side of politics who raised it.
And look, when you do have more complainants, that obviously becomes a lot more serious, credible, and he did act very swiftly once he'd received all of that. But coming back to how he reacted to Lidia Thorpe's accusation, it doesn't seem as though, well, he said very clearly it was not something that he was acting on the back of, and he didn't speak to her.
Well, that's the cultural issue that some within the Liberal Party, or women who've previously been in the Liberal Party, have now decided to talk about again in the wake of what's happened. The fact that when these issues are raised, it doesn't necessarily mean the leadership takes immediate action, treats it with seriousness. Of course, we continue to stress David Van says this is a travesty of justice. He denies these allegations. But for Peter Dutton as opposition leader, the leader of the Liberal Party, not to immediately try and understand further is very hard, I think, for him to justify at this point.
Well, then we get to this big question about raising the allegations publicly at all, right? Whether it's in the media or under parliamentary privilege on the floor of the Senate, or whether Lidia Thorpe should have gone to lawyers or the police and dealt with this privately. Look, here was her view on that.
The police are not an option for women who've experienced sexual violence. Women do not go to the police. The police need to change their behaviours and look at themselves as to why people like me and so many other women do not go to the police.
Is that a common view?
It is a common view. There are a lot of women who make a calculation that that's not the avenue they want to go down, and we've heard from parliamentarians for them as well. They wanted cultural change potentially, they wanted something to be done internally, they wanted to feel safe individually in the building, but for whatever reason, it's not an avenue they want to take. And in the report that was done in the wake of the Brittany Higgins allegation, when the Parliament was canvassed in that process of actually taking interviews, one of the common views was there was no incentive to report misconduct. It probably won't change anything, or it may make it worse. And I think taking that step to go to the police is a part of that question.
And I think you really saw that in the statement that Amanda Stoker made, both the written statement and her comments in the show she was hosting on Sky News. She was saying, I just wanted to keep this private. It was only when it became obvious to me that it was going to be made public that I have spoken out. But she really thought she had gone through the processes that she needed to and dealt with it.
Yeah, I don't think we can police the processes people go through. Boom, boom, police. I think every woman wants to pursue a different path. I think broadly, though, and I've dealt with the police, some individual police are excellent, but they are very difficult to deal with and they're really busy, and you can't pursue everything through the police. That's why we have to have robust systems in our workplaces and institutions to
let's
deal
talk
with
about
some
that.
of these
So this wasn't there in 2021, but what's there now in Parliament House? I mean, this is important. What mechanisms, this parliamentary workplace support service?
Yeah.
Where is that up to? What can it do?
So it was set up almost immediately, and it's been expanded since in the wake of Brittany Higgins making her allegations public. It's available to anyone who works in Parliament House or in the parliamentary offices. It does do some investigation of complaints, which is, as Peter Dutton says, he's referred these allegations to the PWSS. It also does counselling, support services, crisis intervention, provides MPs with some kind of HR functions or advice in how they can deal with their staff if something is reported to them.
So this has been an important change.
It has been. I think it is an important change that it's there. It wasn't there 2 years ago. It is supposed to be getting even stronger powers. It needs legislation that will give it the powers to make findings of misconduct and also be able to recommend sanctions against MPs, which could even, if it's in line with Jenkins, it could even include suspension from Parliament.
That's going to get controversial.
Yeah, but that will be controversial, and we haven't seen the legislation yet. The government is saying it will be done by the end of this year. I mean, the recommendation in the Jenkins report was that this full independent commission be set up within 12 months. We're more than 12 months from when the report came out.
Maybe this will give things a kick along.
I think it's worth saying in all of this that we would not have these new structures if it wasn't for Brittany Higgins to make these allegations about what happened allegedly to her in the Parliament, in a minister's office, through the media. So while we've had that debate and there's a real should have gone straight to police, indeed her very decision about going public to try and change this for women and really lead to this cultural reckoning which we've had and we continue to have quite obviously is because she talked about it publicly.
Just a quick one before we move off this, and we are going to talk more about the Coalition's pursuit of Katy Gallagher. But Peter Dutton, in booting him out of the party room, David Van says, I've been denied due process here. Was Peter Dutton right, Anna, to... he says he's not judging the veracity of the claims, but he's punished him, right? He wants him out of the Parliament altogether. Yep. Was he right to do that?
The public standard has now been set around allegations of this nature and what action needs to be taken. It was clear when Peter Dutton stood up, held that snap press conference to make that statement that he was treating it with great gravity. There is, though, still within the Parliament, particularly within parts of the Liberal Party, a concern about how this has played out because we do have a justice system. And the idea that people don't have a chance to potentially use that to try and clear their name is also a live issue. But I think the public standard has been set around these matters and how they need to be dealt with. And so Peter Dutton has taken up that standard.
And there were multiple allegations. So Absolutely. I think everyone actually does deserve a due process, and thank God we now have mechanisms within the parliament that have been established in the wake of that reckoning 2 years ago. But equally, this was a pattern of behaviour, alleged behaviour, that Peter Dutton was made aware of. Now, as the leader of the Liberal Party, for him to continue to stand by this person who was facing multiple allegations would have been, diabolical for him.
The options would have been, stand him aside while things are investigated. But look, I don't think he had much choice but to show really decisive action in this situation.
And this senator has now resigned from the Liberal Party. Yeah. Well, he's only resigned from the Liberal Party because he was about to get booted.
He has 2 years left in the Senate. They can't kick him out of the Senate, so he'll sit on the crossbench. Look, I just want to point out these conversations, these discussions can be difficult. So there's the number for 1800 RESPECT. It's available for free, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to support people impacted by domestic, family or sexual violence. Time to talk to the National Senate leader, Bridget McKenzie, now. To take us there, here was her colleague, Barnaby Joyce, on what Lidia Thorpe should have done.
I think that the issue there also is one where Senator Thorpe should take this to a solicitor, take this to the police, and in this case, it gives Senator Van the capacity to defend it. If there's a precedent, it's a very, very bad one, and that is that we will prosecute criminal cases in both the House of Representatives, the Senate.
Bridget McKenzie, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, David.
So do you agree with Barnaby Joyce, or do you think Lidia Thorpe was right to speak up about David Van?
I don't agree with Barnaby Joyce on this matter. Parliamentary privilege is a powerful and very careful part of our democracy, and senators across the ages have used it in very powerful ways to raise claims and matters of public interest from time to time. Senator Thorpe was absolutely within her right to use parliamentary privilege to raise those issues as she did. The fact that when we do discuss sexual assault in the way that we have in the recent past, it can be incredibly traumatic for those people who have been through those types of incidents, and whether it's our staff, our colleagues, or indeed the broader community. This time, just like the last time, there have been quite visceral responses, which I believe hers was.
So were you surprised to hear allegations of this sort made against Senator Van?
I wasn't aware of any specific allegations at all, but as always in this place, and the media would be well aware of this, there are rumours from time to time about certain individuals. So
and you
I was aware of rumours,
right,
but I was not
David
aware
Van.
of any. No, and I wasn't aware of the Amanda Stoker allegations either.
But you were aware of rumours about David Van?
Well, David, there's rumours about various individuals. I've been here for 14 years. I hear a lot of rumours, and if I acted on every single one of them, that would, not result in the best outcome. I probably am a person that, if I have first-hand information, I take action, and I don't listen to gossip or rumours.
Were you aware his office had been moved a couple of years ago?
No, I was not.
As you were National Senate leader at the time, you still are.
Yep.
You weren't told about moving a coalition senator, a Liberal senator's office?
No, and as I understand it, that was a matter between the President at the time, Scott Ryan, the leader of the Liberal Party, and the leader of the Greens, who took that matter seriously, made the appropriate actions.
I wonder if you can just explain to viewers how it is that, in the nature of this building, in this workplace, you have various complainants about a senator, and we were discussing this earlier. There's appears no one really putting two and two together and thinking maybe there's something more to look at here.
Well, I think it also goes to some of the comments the three fantastically strong female journalists you now have on the couch, which, 14 years ago, insiders wouldn't have had three female journalists, and nor would Parliament have three shadow and ministers in three economic portfolios that are women, finance, resources and infrastructure. So a lot has changed over time, and I think we have to recognise that. I know setting up PWSS, which Senator Thorpe's allegations were referred to, is important. That didn't exist 5 years ago. So when you talk about joining the dots, As you know, political parties are quite separate entities. Both the chambers operate as separate entities with their own presiding officers and own processes. And that's why I think setting up the PWSS was so important. So there was a one-stop shop, if you like, for colleagues, for staff within Parliament House, for MPs to be able to go to for confidential counselling and advice on how to handle these, that will also give that procedural fairness that you were talking about earlier as well.
Yeah, but will you be asking any questions of the Liberals as to who knew what and when about Senator Van?
Well, I think Peter Dutton's made absolutely the right call in throwing him out of
but this is
the
2
Liberal
years
Party.
on. This is 2 years on. I mean, do you see any need to explore who knew what and when back then?
Well, David, as soon as Senator Thorpe made those allegations on the floor of Parliament, it was referred to the President, which was absolutely the right thing to do. And then following a second allegation being raised, the leader of the Liberal Party threw this senator out of the party. Now, I think there was a lot of cheers silently across parliamentary offices with such decisive action being taken by a leader. We know that both the Labor Party, One Nation, the Greens, the Liberal Party, all political parties have faced these type of internal challenges over the recent past. And for a leader to be so decisive, I think, was a testament to his strength of feeling around these matters.
Now, you have been asking a lot of questions over the past week of Labor about who knew what and when in relation to the Brittany Higgins rape allegation. What did all of those questions during the week achieve?
Well, I think they were very legitimate questions. When it became apparent that Senator Gallagher knew prior to these allegations being made public through the airing of the project, that she did know that they were coming. And so we asked very, I think, legitimate questions about who knew what when, what they did with that information. I think questions still remain about the compensation payout. It was incredibly quick with respect to the usual timeframes. The assessment of this claim didn't actually specifically excluded evidence from key stakeholders such as Senators Cash and Reynolds. And indeed, it was a significant sum of taxpayers' money. So I think there are still legitimate questions to ask about that process. And I think at the end of the week, those allegations of Senator Gallagher about misleading Parliament, I think, were prosecuted fully in the Senate, as they should be.
Are you suggesting, though, that Labor should have ignored what Brittany Higgins was alleging at the time about how she'd been treated in the building? Was it fair enough for them to pursue this?
I think every opposition should ask legitimate questions of governments in both Senate and House question time. That is actually the process of democracy. And Labor didn't take a backward step at that time. And if you recall the ferocity of both not just the language used, but the tone, specifically targeting certain ministers and former ministers at the time who were also female, I think, we were very careful this week with our tone to make sure that we were sticking to the factual pieces that we wanted to ascertain. And I think that was the right way to go, but still, as I mentioned in my opening comments, that still raises issues for individuals. I mean, like Senator Gallagher, as a senior female on my side of politics, I have regularly, not just community members, but staff members, colleagues coming to me, raising issues of sexual harassment and others. And my job as a senior woman in this place, if we want to see that cultural change, is to actually make sure they're aware of their options, make sure that they know they're going to be supported no matter what they choose, but to keep it confidential, which I do, to make sure that they have agency about what has occurred to them. And I think that is part of that tension. I really would hate to see a situation arise where we are mandatorily having to report these things, because it takes that agency away. And if I think back over my career, I don't think silence in these matters is a good thing. And what we have been able to see over the past few years, as we get more women into senior leadership, as we have exposure around these topics at a public level, we are putting in institutional frameworks to make change, and we are seeing culture change because we're not staying silent.
Can I just pick up what you just said there? Women come to you as a senator, a woman in leadership, and they raise complaints with you about their treatment. You have just said you absolutely respect the confidentiality that's required. So when Katy Gallagher says, as she's been saying all week, that she is not going to breach the confidentiality of Brittany Higgins and David Shiraz at that moment, do you respect that?
Well, at the time in the chamber, I was agreeing with Minister Gallagher, and I wouldn't be the only senior woman in leadership who has both the responsibility to hear that we are the people that people trust to come to us, and that we have an absolute obligation to keep that confidential, because it is every single woman's right to determine how she takes forward what's happened to her.
So why are you asking all these questions of Katy Gallagher? Sorry to interrupt.
She might choose to stay silent.
Yeah.
She might choose to take it to the police. She might choose, as Amanda Stoker did, to front up and resolve the situation to her satisfaction with the person who did the actions to her. And I think, so there's a whole kind of spectrum of options.
But isn't there a contradiction here? You're asking Katy Gallagher to divulge what she did with this information. She's saying she needs to respect their confidentiality.
No, that's why, David, we weren't asking about what the confidentiality that wasn't the questioning. The questioning was, once she knew what she knew, that's in that.
Okay.
What did she do with that? Was that information then used and known by others? Because if you recall back to the prosecution of the then government around these matters, there was sort of this incredulousness that the Prime Minister didn't know that Linda Reynolds had kept those conversations with Brittany Higgins confidential. There was a sort of this incredulousness that hadn't occurred. No one believed Senator Reynolds in that moment. So I do think there needs to be consistency.
I want to move on to some of your portfolio matters. In infrastructure in particular, you've been critical of the government for having a quick review of all the projects in the infrastructure pipeline. We're talking about hundreds of projects. Government says some of them are underfunded, even unfunded completely. What's wrong with having a good look at all of these projects to work out whether they're value for money and are going to deliver some productivity benefit?
Yeah, well, David, the government came to power and conducted an audit of the infrastructure area prior to the October budget, and as a result, slashed over $9.6 billion of infrastructure projects. They then, got rolled in National Cabinet about what the profiling of the $120 billion infrastructure pipeline was going to look like with state governments, with different premiers having different perspectives on which projects should be cancelled and which shouldn't. And so they announced a quick snap review. Well, there is nothing quick or snap or impartial about this review. The Minister herself has been overruled by the Prime Minister about which projects are included and which aren't. And indeed, local governments across the country were stunned when they found out, following Senate estimates, that it just wasn't the 400 infrastructure projects that were up for review, but key programs such as Roads to Recovery, Bridges and Renewal programs that are part of their ongoing budget cycle. I mean, these are programs that were piloted under Hawke and implemented by Howard, and local governments have relied on for decades in some cases to help them maintain and improve their road network. So the government, this is now sort of really thrown into question the independence of the review headed by Mike Murdoch, and really is the government putting on hold. There's going to be significant impacts to the construction industry as they've basically put the whole pipeline on the go slow.
But do you accept there are some things that you guys funded, the grants programs and other infrastructure spending, that the Commonwealth really shouldn't be involved in? Roundabouts, a mini golf course. Is this really the role of the Commonwealth government?
Well, I think if you'll go through the Labor government's commitments both previously and into the future, federal government overreach into state areas is sadly, as a federalist, something that we now have to live with.
So you're both guilty of it.
If we want to get all quite, theoretical and specific about it, we shouldn't be involved in education or health funding either if we're going to be following the constitutional guidelines. So, I think much concern. There's already job losses on halting these major projects because construction companies have geared up for it. They've hired people, they've hired kit and bought kit to actually have this sequenced series of works, and that's all been put on hold for up to 6 months, which is unacceptable.
Final one, the electric vehicles, the government's consulting on a fuel efficiency standard, introducing a fuel efficiency standard in Australia. Plenty of other countries have them, we don't. What's your view in principle on having a fuel efficiency standard in Australia?
Yeah, well, David, we and the Coalition are absolutely committed to a low emissions transport sector. That includes a whole raft of strategies. And I was at the Brisbane Truck Show a couple of weeks ago, and we've got hydrogen heavy haulers, and we've got small electric trucks that Australia Post, for instance, is going to use to deliver parcels around our suburbs. What we need to do is approach this from a principled level at this stage. We're waiting for those submissions.
And what is your position on a fuel efficiency standard?
It needs to be something that's affordable for Australians. It needs to make sure that certain Australians aren't discriminated against over others, people in rural and regional Australia, for instance, people on low incomes. And it needs to make sure that Australians still have the choice of vehicles that we enjoy today. I mean, under our government, EV purchases were going through the roof. That trend is continuing. But people on low incomes are not in that,
So you are willing to negotiate with the government.
Regions.
You are willing to negotiate with the government on the structure of it, but in principle you support the idea of some sort of standard.
Well, in principle, I support the outcome, which is a low emissions transport sector going forward to 2050.
Through a fuel efficiency standard.
Well, we're still in the middle of having a look at what the submissions say and what the recommendations say. So I'm saying I'm approaching this with an open mind, but I have some guardrails around affordability, choice, and who's going to be disadvantaged or not.
All right, Bridget McKenzie, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, mate.
Let's get back to our panel. We're joined once again by Anna Henderson, Patricia Karvelas and Katina Curtis. All right, look, let's just move into this whole coalition pursuit of Katy Gallagher during the week. You heard from the Senator there. They still have questions to ask about the compensation payout in particular. What do you think was achieved, Anna, over the course of the last week in their pursuit of this?
Well, early on for the Coalition, a decision was made to go down this path because there's still such anger within the opposition around what happened in the lead up to the last election and the perceived treatment of members of the government. This was a chance for them to come into the chamber and actually put those questions. So
it gets square.
It gets square, but also, legitimate questions according to the Liberal Party around some things that haven't been transparent, the payout and the conversations that were had in the lead up to what happened when the allegation was made public. But in the end, what happened is that there was a question raised about whether or not this decision was made that would trigger people across the country, and it triggered someone in the Parliament who then got up, made an allegation about the Liberal Party, and the whole focus is now back on what happens within the Liberal Party and an allegation and the loss of a Liberal senator.
Well, look for when that happened, like, boy, this strategy's really backfired. But they kept going the next day and the next day with more questions.
I mean, Bridget McKenzie mentioned there about the tone of the questions. They did on the Friday. I mean, they backed off in the Senate. The Senate unusually sat on Friday, and during question time, there was only 2 questions on this matter, and then they moved on to other matters. So I think they did back off slightly, but as you say, there was still questioning continued.
Yeah. It's about saving face a bit for them now. So you will see that they will still pursue it, because I was interested in this and I made a lot of calls over the weekend, like, you going to keep going? I mean, this literally has blown up on them.
What do you think? We
began this program talking about their former senator now. I do think they won't dump it all together, but a real easing back is the sense I get. And there's a broader picture here too. There are people in the Liberal Party who I've spoken to, MPs, who are very, very, very concerned that at a time of great economic uncertainty at a time where families are really on their knees struggling with how to manage their mortgages, if they are lucky enough to have a mortgage, or their rents, that the opposition that clearly still does have an image problem with women, there is no doubt about it, it's numerical, we know it from the public polling, but we know it from the seats that they lost, that they would be doubling down on this issue, even if they think there are some legitimate issues. Politics is about choices. What choices do you make to pursue things? And even on their own side, there's a view, God, why are we doing this?
Well, I tell you, if they do keep going tomorrow and the next day in Parliament, my understanding is the PM's ready to come back at them with the David Van stuff. Who knew what, when, how on earth was this not, sorted out years ago? So we'll see what happens there. But on I guess the substance of what the coalition's trying to get at here, that this was politically weaponised by Labor back in 2021. As I said in the interview, Katy Gallagher, she's sticking to a pretty tight script here. She's not going to divulge any more than what she said, that she had some knowledge days before the rape allegations were made public.
What you're asking me to do here is to disclose information that was given to me and asked to be kept by me in confidence by a woman who was alleged to have been raped.
Now, fair enough, but at the heart of this, was Labor being entirely pure-hearted in the way they raised questions, went after that whole issue a couple of years ago?
I mean, they obviously thought that there was a political advantage. I think you also see they were responding. There were two sides on this 2 years ago, and they were responding to how the government at the time responded to the events as well.
What do you think, looking back?
Well, I think part of it was certainly there was a political use of the material. There was also someone who made an allegation and wanted to engage with a political party, very different to now. It's being brought up in the Senate without the role of that person being sort of considered. So back then there was engagement, there was a wish to see it politically raised. And then the Prime Minister at the time, Scott Morrison, made a series of comments which were seen as entirely tone-deaf to community expectations. He sought advice from his wife, Jenny, about his own daughters when he was thinking through the allegation, that people will be met with bullets in other countries. Those kinds of statements were one that the Liberal leader made and really added to the problem for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we even accept the Liberal Party's view that Labor has weaponised this, even if we accept that, and there's a debate around that, boy, oh boy, as Anna just said, did the Liberal government at the time help in that process of making this a weapon that was actually damaging to them. The handling of it was quite obviously appalling at the time. This week, I think the Libs, and I think they failed at this, have tried to establish a political conspiracy, and I don't think they've got their smoking gun on that. Clearly what Katy Gallagher said to the Senate was not consistent with what was the case.
Oh, yeah,
That's a fact.
Yep.
We're in semantic territory when she's giving her explanation.
That's right. But equally, was she part of an orchestrated political campaign, or was she briefed by the complainant, the alleged complainant, and her partner?
They certainly haven't established that she told the Prime Minister or Penny Wong or anything. None of that. There's no smoking gun around any of that. Now, look, you can argue some of their questioning of Linda Reynolds and so on in the weeks that followed was too strong, and that's clearly the concern and underlying some of the response we've seen this week. Just one other issue on this that I wanted to note. We talked about this on the show last week, the publication of the leaked texts, and a lot of concern about that during the week. That goes to who leaks information that was meant to be there only for the criminal trial and not released beyond that. But what about the publication of this? Because some of the Teal independents this week have been raising concerns about media reporting this stuff, and the government's even looking at this too, aren't they, Anna?
So that becomes a question of whether or not it's an issue for media organisations that can rest with them to make the ethical decision around what is published. There's definitely very little appetite within media organisations to see some kind of ban put in place because of what that would do, the chilling effect.
Well, that's putting it mildly. There's a right-to-know coalition. It involves the ABC, SBS, News 9, The Guardian, and they're all concerned about any law that says you cannot publish this stuff.
Yeah, I think a law which restricts what can be. So I believe that this has been unethical to publish some of these texts that and clearly re-traumatising. I think there's a duty of care issue in relation to. You
don't think there's any public interest though in knowing that Katy Gallagher knew?
I think that as a journalist, I'm interested in exactly how things transpire, and I think the opposition does, absolutely. And opposition, now they're the government, sorry, there's been a flip, should make that clear. I would never stand on the side of, oh, no questions to answer. But I think that you do have to weigh up. Journalism makes judgments all the time. Journalists make judgments all the time about what we share, about the level of the public interest. You ask about law reform, though. I don't think there should be new laws to restrict journalists from publishing anything which is in the potential public interest. I personally believe that this did not meet that threshold. Some of the publishing of these texts has been nothing short of re-traumatising for somebody who I think anyone watching this would agree has probably gone through enough.
Look, I want to move on to housing. We're just 6 weeks, less than 6 weeks since the budget. The government's found another $2 billion down the back of the couch.
Oh, there it is.
I think maybe the stronger jobs market shows the revenues are perhaps a little rosier than we knew 6 weeks ago even. Anyway, $2 billion the Prime Minister announced yesterday for public housing. Now, he says this is not connected to the Housing Australia Future Fund, very separate, regardless what happens on the vote in the Senate on the Housing Australia Future Fund, which the Greens are holding up, and the Coalition. This $2 billion will go out the door before the end of the financial year, so lickety-split. But clearly he's got a message to the Senate as well.
We have, in addition, next week, of course, potentially a vote on the Housing Australia Future Fund, where both the Coalition and the Greens political party have held it up. They are playing this game of not voting against it. It's just been deferred. Well, that's just a political game.
Well, the Greens are claiming this as a win, as a back down, and my understanding is this does bring them a step closer to supporting it. They'll make a decision in the coming days. They've got a party room meeting. They still want caps on rents, and they want some sort of national coordination of rent caps. And look, they don't feel like they're in a rush to have this voted on this week, but what do you think? What's going to happen?
Yeah, the government still very much wants this to go to a vote in the Senate this week. It has been doing a bit of debt clearing in terms of legislation in the past week, and they will try to get it to a vote. I mean, the last time they tried to get a vote, the Greens and the Coalition teamed up for a procedural matter to say it can't go ahead. So, I mean, the Prime Minister's saying it's, on the one hand, he's like, well, the $2 billion, it's nothing to do with that other issue, but then he's going out and attacking the Greens over it. The Greens certainly see it as something of a back down from the government.
Well, they've been arguing for a while to have money straight from the budget put into public housing, not just through this fund.
So they could say, you know, we made this happen. We got the extra $2 billion in the next financial year, so we applied the pressure. That's a win for us. What then has to happen within the Greens when they have their party room meeting is the calculation around how much is our next election campaign really designed around housing. Can we still campaign on rent issues past this, and can we still have... You know, there is a political element to what they do.
Absolutely, yeah. Look, they're not going to vote against it, but it's whether they voted in. We'll see. It's still in play. The other one I wanted to touch on quickly is the Russian embassy, the new Russian embassy that was going to be built, or perhaps it was never going to be built, but next door to Parliament House. But a law was passed in, must have been record time, in a matter of...
6 minutes.
6 minutes. Anyway, rushed through both houses to stop the Russians building an embassy at this site that's right next door to Parliament House. What do we know about exactly why they had to take that action?
I mean, the security analysts and experts say that that site would have put a new Russian embassy building within the Telstra Tower and Parliament House. The ability to intercept communications was a problem. Also, Havana syndrome was raised, the potential that that very obscure issue that's been raised around people experiencing dizziness, nausea and cognitive dysfunction from this syndrome, that in some way there is a risk around Russia with that.
In Parliament House even.
Exactly. But at the same time, there is also the larger question for the government, which is what ways can it apply pressure to Russia without expelling diplomats?
I think that's a really good point, right? Look, I think it absolutely is a strategic decision, and that's why you've got no opposition to it. I mean, who would oppose? It's an obvious one, but we still haven't expelled the Russian diplomats. At the start of the war in Ukraine, there was a lot of pressure for our government to do that. They made the calculation not to do that. I think this still sends a message without doing that and deprives Russia of what they want to do.
Katina, you asked the PM a good question. What about the Chinese embassy that's also just down the road from Parliament House?
That's right. And I mean, he didn't really answer it. I guess the difference is that the Chinese embassy is already established. It's been there for a long time. We were talking about a new build for Russia that would be much closer as opposed to the embassy they've already got that's a few suburbs away.
And I'm also told the Russian tech, when it comes to spying, interfering, all of these sort of things, is actually pretty advanced.
They have been working on it for a while.
They've had a bit of experience in this regard. All right, our panel, Patricia Karvelas, Henderson and Katina Curtis, will be back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with the award-winning host of the podcast Irrational Fear, the one and only Dan Ilic, and a very warm welcome.
Thanks, Mike. It's okay to be here?
Yeah. Tough week.
Yeah,
mate.
tough week.
Tough week. It wasn't so much an upper and lower house in Canberra this week. It was a lower house and a how low can you go a house.
I don't know about you, but I feel very dirty this week.
Lydia Thorpe got up and made some speeches, and it was kind of invited by the fact that the previously unheard of Senator Van talking about behaviour in Parliament House, and Lydia just couldn't stomach it.
Yeah, and using her parliamentary privilege to call him out. And of course, Senator Van has denied these accusations.
Vehemently. When Parliament gets this tough, it's quite hard to photograph, because in a still you have to condense all these quite complicated and terribly awful things that were going on in the Senate down to one particular moment, because Lydia was obviously very emotional through the whole process.
Yeah.
It was good to see that her former colleagues from the Greens sort of gathered around and gave her some support, I think. And I'm not sure that Pauline was giving much support here.
This is my favourite photo from the Senate I have ever seen, because I know exactly what Lydia is saying. It is not safe for Sunday morning on the ABC.
No. Here is the aforementioned Senator David Van.
This photo makes me feel uncomfortable because I can tell just how uncomfortable he is.
Yeah, it's the letting in the air into the collar. Lovely Kadelka. And now there's a senator getting kicked out of the party room. How's a man supposed to feel safe around here? Sometimes the cartoonist can get to the actual nub of the story. The opposition leader acted very swiftly with Senator David Van. When he came out and said we've asked him not to sit in the party room, I was like, whoa.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I did love this David Pope, who's channeling Macbeth, I think, the double political trouble, the witches. Meanwhile, at the rehearsal of Brittany, the Conspiracy of Witches.
OK, everyone, this might be a good spot for an intermission.
As the chap comes in with the Thorpe and Van allegations to the director here. I did like this David Rowe. It's politics now, number 113. She said, and then an awful lot of he said. Morrison, Gagens, Dutton, etc.
Yeah, we all kind of forget this is not about politics. This is about actually someone's life that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Scott Morrison is clearly checked out in his Hawaiian shirt, but he also takes his trophy wherever he goes.
Yeah. Brett Lethbridge seems to think that the questions about weaponising of rape allegations may be backfiring.
And here's Peter Dutton saying, we're weaponising the weaponising. The problem is when you use a cannon this big, is the backfire.
Yeah. Dan, I thought Fiona Katauskas got to the actual point of all this. Who in their right mind would come forward with allegations of sexual assault in Parliament House after they see the way that people who are trying to report this have been treated this week?
Yeah.
You have the right not to remain silent, but anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of public opinion, the Sexual Assault Reporting Unit. The Indictment of former President Donald Trump in the United States, Dan, has everyone thinking inside the box.
One of the excuses Donald Trump had for keeping his secret papers in the toilet was, hey, it's a secure location, it's got a lock.
Yeah. Lovely Megan Herbert cartoon. He's got witch hunts then and now. Then it was ignite and incinerate.
And now it's indict and nominate.
Yeah, and he's the MAGA 2024. Glenn Lelieva is channeling not so much the Manhattan Project as the Mar-a-Lago project here, exploding.
This is atomic documents, you know, and I love this exploding because what Donald Trump has done here is he's simultaneously created his own ticker tape parade as well. Donald Trump can run for president from jail, win, and become president.
I know. Dan, it's been a very tough week in politics, and I think we need to go and have a shower.
Yeah, that's right. Back to you, Spearsy.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Katina, it's you first.
First thing tomorrow morning in the Senate, we'll see the final vote to pass the legislation to hold the referendum on the Indigenous voice. I was in the up at Barunga Festival last weekend where the 4 Northern Territory land councils came together to back the voice. The opening of the festival, Jawoyn Elder Lisa Mumbin gave a very passionate speech saying 35 years ago Bob Hawke stood on that land and said in 2 years' time we will have treaty. That didn't happen, obviously, but she said, together we can thrive if all Australians work together and make this happen.
PK.
Yeah, I mean, yes, mine's similar. Tomorrow, of course, this passes, and then between 3 to 6 months, the referendum must be held. We still don't have the actual date, although, you know, there are a few hot favourites. But it doesn't have to be held if the government makes a call. And I know that's a controversial position. I'm not about to say it's not going to be held, but the local government referendum enabling legislation was passed and then lapsed. It has happened before.
We'll see. Anna.
And the Secretary-General of the Pacific Islands Forum, Henry Puna, was in town this week, very much under the radar with everything else that was going on. But he had a meeting with the Prime Minister. He says there are still a lot of Pacific countries concerned about the AUKUS deal, not just the potential for a nuclear leak, but also what China could do in retaliation. He wants to take that to all the AUKUS leaders. So it'll be interesting to see how they ameliorate those concerns.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you all very much for the discussion this morning. Finally, the film Dune was a box office smash when it was released a couple of years ago, but our very own Hugh Parkinson thought it was missing an important character. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Today we witness the most evil and heinous abuse of power in the history of our country.
How bad is it?
Nobody can even believe it. I never thought such a thing could happen to America.
Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with felony violations of our national security laws, as well as participating in a conspiracy to obstruct justice.
I didn't need this. I had a great life.
I feel good. Inside the mask, you'll find a tube to allow you to drink the recycled water.
Mine is peanuts. Does anybody want to drive for an hour and then get a Burger King?
I knew that I wouldn't.
Every time I fly over a blue state, I get a subpoena.
Do you consider yourself humorous?
I do great voices.
What do you mean you do voices?
It's what I do. I'll give you an example. Sir, what you said is inappropriate. We got a box. I got a box. And then they say, Trump is obstructioning. He's obstructing. Why did you say that, sir? Why did you say that? We want to indict you for what you said, sir. As far as the joke of an indictment, it's a horrible thing. I'm not the one who thinks I'm above the law. I'm the one that followed the law.
Use the voice.
I did everything right and they indicted me.
I feel very excited about being here.